Thank you very much. Senator Shaheen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, I want to thank you, Assistant Secretary Mitchell, and our charge in Turkey, Phil Kosnet, for your hard work and coordination on the efforts to release Pastor Brunson. As you pointed out, his move from prison to house arrest is a positive development. Obviously, we have a lot more work to do in terms of getting him back to the United States and also pressing the Turkish government to release the other Americans that they're holding. But it is a positive step, and thank you for that. Because it's been 1 week since, a little over a week, since the Helsinki meeting between President Trump and Vladimir Putin. And yet, other than the brief description you just gave us, we don't really know what was discussed in that meeting. We've heard DNI Coates, General Votel, and a number of State Department officials, including those who were present in last week's committee meeting on Iran, indicate that they still don't have a full understanding of what was discussed in that meeting. And we're seeing almost daily attempts by the Kremlin to take advantage of this opportunity as they release their own readouts of the conversation and broadcast news of various agreements that they say were reached in that meeting. So for me, that's why I'm so concerned and why I want to know exactly what was agreed to in that meeting. On Syria, President Trump said at his joint news conference that the two leaders discussed Syria at length. The Russian Ministry of Defense has indicated that the two leaders agreed to military cooperation in Syria. Did they do that?
Senator, the United States policy with respect to deconfliction with Russia has not changed. I will defer to the Department of Defense for details around that, but I can tell you that the policy that was in place with respect to their efforts to keep American pilots safe and keep American forces safe in Syria, that policy has not changed.
Do you know if they discussed that policy? If they discussed?
Senator, I do know that they discussed Syria. They absolutely discussed Syria. The focus of that discussion, and I think President Trump has shared this, was an effort to find a political resolution there and to get the displaced persons the opportunity to return to Syria. And I think the President's talked about one more item. So as the President shared it, I feel like I can as well. I think he also talked about America's continued commitment to ensure that Israel was secure from threats in Syria as well. And that topic was discussed by them as well. I think the President has previously shared that.
Do you know if there was any sort of downgrading of our U.S. presence in in Syria that was discussed?
Senator, there's been no change in U.S. policy with respect to our activities in Syria.
I understand, but that's not exactly the question.
Senator, it's what matters. It's what matters. What matters is what President Trump has directed us to do following his meeting with Vladimir Putin. It's what he has told his senior leadership team to do and how he wants us to deploy his foreign policy strategy.
And do you know if the frozen stabilization funds for Syria, the $200 million, was that ever discussed?
Senator, we are still working to review that policy. That's a State Department policy. We are still working to review it. The policy was the same the day before as it was the day after the President's meeting with Vladimir Putin.
And do you know if Iran was referenced in the context of Syria in their discussions?
Senator, again, it's not for me to disclose the contents of those conversations. I can tell you that each time I've spoken with President Trump, both before Helsinki summit and after, Iran has been at a central point that we have focused on with respect to U.S. policy in Syria. I'm confident will remain so.
So, in an interview, General Votel was asked about whether a deal had been made on Syria between President Trump and Vladimir Putin. And he said, as you indicated, that he had received no instructions to change what he's doing. And he went further on to say, and I quote, "I would want to make sure that this isn't something that we stepped into lightly. I'm not recommending that, and that would be a pretty big step at this point." In response to his comments, the Russian Ministry of Defense put out a statement and also posted on social media, and again, I'm quoting the Russian media. They say, With his statements, General Votel not only discredited the official position of his Supreme Commander-in-Chief, but also exacerbated the illegality under international law and U.S. law of the military presence of American servicemen in Syria. Can you tell me what our response has been to the Russian Ministry of Defense with respect to this statement?
Senator, my guess the response would be most appropriately from the Department of Defense and not from the Department of State, but I will humbly suggest to you that you ought to have more confidence in statements from General Votel than the Russian Ministry of Defense.
I do have more confidence in General Votel's statement. That's why I'm raising this question, because it seems to me that our response to the Russian Ministry of Defense ought to be very strong to say they have nothing to say about what our generals are doing in Syria. That's not their business. That's our business. And I would hope that that's a point that we make very strongly. I had the opportunity to visit Syria a little over 2 weeks ago, and I was very impressed with the work that our military has been doing in northeast Syria along the Turkish border. I was very impressed with the work of the Syrian Democratic Forces. And what I heard over and over again, both from the men and women who were serving and from the civilians, Syrian civilians on the ground, was, please don't leave us here to the fate of either Assad or the Russians or other forces that may come into that part of Syria. And please, just a little bit in help for reconstruction efforts would go a very long way. That part of Syria has stabilized. They are into reconstruction. They are sending back people who have been displaced to their homes. And it would be, I believe, a real terrible reversal of policy for us to leave those folks after what we've done and to turn them over to the Russians or to Assad's forces.
Senator, if I might, just so the facts are clear, the previous administration is the one that enabled Russia to have the capacity that they have in Syria today.
I'm not defending the previous administration, Mr. Secretary. I want this administration to continue doing what's working.
Its policy, this administration's policy. You're advocating for the continuation of this administration's policy. I think that's important for everyone to understand.
Senator Flake.